Tonight at 10, Theresa May confirms she will not trigger the process of leaving the EU this year. On her first overseas visit as Prime Minister, Mrs May holds talks with the EU's most powerful leader, Chancellor Merkel of Germany. And she underlined her wish for Britain and Germany to retain close links after the UK has left the European Union.
I also want to be clear here today and across Europe in the weeks ahead that we are not walking away from our European friends. Britain will remain an outward-looking country and Germany will remain a vital partner and a special friend for us.
And from the Germans came a signal that they're willing to give the UK some time to settle its negotiating position.
Everyone has an interest in things being prepared carefully and for positions to be clear. I find it absolutely understandable that a certain amount of time is needed.
We'll have details of today's visit to Berlin and we'll be looking at the negotiating challenge facing the Prime Minister. Also tonight, tributes to the soldier who's died after completing a fitness test on the Brecon Beacons. In Turkey, President Erdogan supporters are out in force again as he declares a state of emergency in the wake of the failed coup. Trump's in town in Ohio on the eve of his formal acceptance speech as the Republican presidential candidate. And Sunderland's Sam Allardyce is to be named as the New England football manager within the next 24 hours.
Here in the south, it's an attack that's over in seconds, but the effects last forever. The worrying increase in acid assaults and unacceptable for passengers. The new rail minister's verdict about Southern Rail.
Good evening. On her first overseas visit as Prime Minister, Theresa May has held talks in Berlin with Angela Merkel. The German Chancellor said that Britain needed to have a clear view on what kind of relationship it wanted with the European Union before any talks could begin on the process of withdrawal. Mrs May said that she would not trigger that process this year and went on to insist that the outcome of the referendum did not mean that Britain was walking away from its European friends. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, was travelling with the Prime Minister.
When you host a special guest for the first time, you want everything to be perfect. The music, immaculate surroundings, and then the moment. Very good to meet you, she says, because even world leaders have to introduce themselves to each other. It's just that these two women inspecting the German military have in their hands the future of our place in the world. This wasn't just the first appearance of this duo, but Theresa May's first press conference as Prime Minister. As is her style, she'd come prepared.
Vielen Dank. Es freut mich sehr, in Berlin zu sein.
Thanks for having me.
I will now go into English.
But courtesy will only get you so far. There's hard bargaining ahead.
I've been clear that Brexit means Brexit and the United Kingdom is going to make a success of it. But I also want to be clear here today and across Europe in the weeks ahead that we are not walking away from our European friends. Britain will remain an outward-looking country and Germany will remain a vital partner and a special friend for us.
But she won't start the official process of leaving the EU, as some leaders want, until next year. Her German counterpart seemed understanding to an extent, but no real talks, formal or informal, can start until the process begins, she said. And limbo is in no one's interest, as Chancellor Merkel just started the clock.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Is it worth sacrificing some of our prosperity to have more control on immigration? And Chancellor Merkel, is it remotely realistic for the UK to expect to keep its trading rights and introduce tighter limits on immigration?
It's very clear to me that one of the messages that the British people gave in their vote that the UK should leave the European Union was that they wanted to see control brought into the movement of people from the European Union into the United Kingdom. But I'm also clear that we want to get the right deal in trade and goods and services for the UK.
It's no longer the case that the British Prime Minister will sit round the table, she said. But we have to listen to what they want before we can find a solution. There were halting moments, but the Prime Minister was no novice. Lifted perhaps by Tory cheers at her first Prime Minister's questions.
Questions to the Prime Minister.
The Tory bench is delighted as she mercilessly went after Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and at echoes perhaps of the female Prime Minister that went before.
I suspect that there are many members on the opposition benches who might be familiar with an unscrupulous boss. A boss, and maybe even a boss who exploits the rules to further his own career. Remind him of anybody?
Above all, it was a day of firsts.
You've just met for the first time. What do you make of each other?
Two women who, if I may say so, I think get on with the job and both want to deliver the best possible results for the people of the UK and the people of Germany.
Would she agree? Exactly, she said. There's no doubt they're together on that. But there's not much chance, with everything at stake, that in the coming months they'll agree on the lot.
Laura Kunsberg reporting there. We'll be talking to Laura in Berlin in just a few minutes' time. But just to underline, the task facing Theresa May in negotiating Britain's exit from the European Union has been made substantially more difficult because of the lack of planning by David Cameron's government. That is the view of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which was highly critical of the failure to draw up any contingency plans. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins is with me now with his assessment of the challenges ahead.
Hugh, what we're seeing in Berlin tonight is Britain facing the first of many challenges on the long road to Brexit. Britain is in a unique position. No member state has ever left the EU before, and all the other 27 states want their interests protected. Germany and Chancellor Merkel are the dominant power. She's made very clear that for her, the interests of the EU 27 and the future health of the EU are paramount. Tomorrow, Theresa May will be in France, where President François Hollande, vulnerable to right-wing anti-EU sentiment, is likely to give the Prime Minister a harder time. And today, a Commons committee condemned David Cameron for refusing to allow any contingency planning for a Leave victory, calling that gross negligence.
It was a considered decision not to do that planning. And of course, on the Friday morning when the Prime Minister resigned, the situation in that sense looked catastrophic. The country and the bureaucracy unprepared for the consequences. And that's really, we believe, unforgivable, because there were only two outcomes from the referendum. We were either voting to stay or we were voting to leave.
Of course, the biggest political challenge will be the formal Brexit negotiations. Ahead of them, Britain does hold one strong card: deciding when to trigger divorce proceedings, the legal process called Article 50, probably late this year or early next. That starts 2 years of intense bargaining between the UK and the EU on the exit terms, including the framework of our future relations. And at its political heart, how much can Britain keep of its free trade from the single market, while at the same time taking back control of migration from the EU? Views differ about the balance which is in Britain's best interests, but many argue limiting numbers is precisely what many people voted for.
The referendum was won on a crystal clear basis. We're going to take back control over our borders, our money and our democracy. That's not part of the negotiation. That's what the referendum has given us a mandate, an instruction to do. What we need to thrash out is the extent to which we continue to trade, and that's in both sides' interests.
So what does the future look like? Even when the exit deal has been done, perhaps in 2019, there's a whole set of negotiations with other countries about future trade with them. The government points to early enthusiasm from Australia to boost trade. But do we have enough lawyers and trade negotiators to pull all this off? One leading lawyer who backed Remain says each deal requires huge resources.
Well, it's definitely much bigger than anything we have seen before, and much more complex than anything that we have seen before. There are ongoing negotiations. These things take typically teams of 50 plus specialists. We just don't have negotiators. The government here does not have bilateral trade negotiators.
And Theresa May did confirm today she's willing to hire in just that sort of talent. It could prove very expensive, but this is a Brexit government which has to get it right. No wonder leaders across Europe are delighted the summer holidays are just starting. Everyone wants to draw breath, take stock and plan strategy for the battles ahead. Hugh.
James, thanks very much again. James Robbins there for us, our diplomatic correspondent. Well, let's go live to Berlin then and talk to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. And Laura, what do today's events, do you think, tell us about the way that Theresa May wants to manage this process?
Well, Hugh, there was a massive moment here in Berlin tonight, and Downing Street is pretty encouraged with how it went. It was warm but brisk, relaxed but businesslike. But I think also the message from Berlin was very clear. We're not intent on punishing Britain for its decision. We will give you a little time. But to be frank, Britain must make up its mind about what it really wants from its exit from the European Union before any real business can be done. Now, to put it kindly, that picture is very much still evolving at home. And until that moves on from being vague ambition, it's hard to see how any significant progress can really be made abroad. These talks are going to be difficult, but we're nowhere near at the stage of anything concrete being put on the table. And that's a message that may well be echoed by other European leaders in the days to come.
Laura, once again, thanks very much. Laura Kuenssberg there for us in Berlin tonight. Now, police in Mid Wales are investigating the death of a soldier who collapsed at his barracks in the Brecon Beacons after a training exercise on the hottest day of the year so far. 26-year-old Josh Hoole was a member of the Rifles Regiment based at Catterick. He'd been preparing for a selection course at the Dering Line Barracks, from where our Wales correspondent Hywel Griffith sent this report.
A dedicated soldier, Josh Hoole's family say the army was his life. Tonight they want to know if the armed forces could have done more to protect it. The 26-year-old was in the Brecon Beacons to prepare for a gruelling selection course. At 7 a.m. he went on an 8-mile fitness test, carrying a 25-kilogram pack. He collapsed back at the base. Paramedics couldn't save him. His family fear the rising temperature may have played a part.
My father had said he knew he was training, and it had bothered them that he was training when we knew that it was that heat. Can't get your head around why do you have people out when you know the weather's that hot.
The army uses this terrain to test its elite. 3 years ago, an SAS selection exercise on the hottest day of the year led to 3 deaths. James Dunsby was found collapsed near the finish line. Edward Mayer suffered heat exhaustion and died in hospital. Craig Roberts was found on a different part of the 16-mile route. An inquest found all 3 died as a result of neglect. The Ministry of Defence says this latest death was different.
We don't yet know the circumstances or indeed the reasons why he died, but I can confirm it was not on Special Forces selection. This was about training for a career course that he was going to do in Brecon to become a sergeant. And we will understand what happened, I hope, soon, so that we're able to be clear about the circumstances.
The army says this was a routine test on local roads and that temperatures didn't go above 22 degrees Celsius. But tonight, again, it faces questions over the pressures soldiers face away from the battlefield. Hywel Griffith, BBC News, Brecon.
At least 500 people are now thought to have been killed in South Sudan after soldiers turned on each other in the capital, Juba, earlier this month. South Sudan became independent 5 years ago, but in 2013, civil war broke out, largely along ethnic lines, when the 2 most powerful men in the country, from the 2 main ethnic groups, fell out. Then a peace deal brought both of them back to the table in April of this year, but barely 3 months later, tension between their troops turned to heavy fighting in Juba, and the country now faces a humanitarian crisis. A warning that this report by our Africa correspondent Alistair Lether does start with some distressing images.
Taban is just 2. This is a bullet wound. Peace has been shattered in South Sudan, just a few months after a deal ended 2 years of civil war. Taban's mother said during the heavy fighting, soldiers burst into her home. One opened fire. She fell backwards and her baby was hit. Heavy weapons were fired across the city. In the chaos, some international aid workers were raped and beaten. Peacekeepers were injured. 2 died as an under-resourced UN was blocked from leaving its bases, unable to intervene.
They were trying to shoot those soldiers who were here.
Weeks of a tense ceasefire snapped into heavy fighting at State House. The president and his rival vice president were meeting inside when their bodyguards suddenly started fighting. Journalists waiting for a news conference cowered as gunfire erupted around them.
We are calling on all the population, all South Sudanese.
Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir, in the hat, jointly appealed for calm. But their political differences started a broadly ethnic-based civil war, and their words didn't stop their troops fighting for days. Machar then left the city. The peace deal hangs by a thread.
I think what we are dealing with, for me, is a setback when it comes to implementation of the peace agreement. But we have a huge challenge in this country, huge humanitarian challenge that we are dealing with. The levels of needs in this country are incredible.
More than 2 million people have been displaced by this crisis. 170,000 live in UN camps. Clinics are busy. Cholera has broken out. 2 years of war and economic collapse has weakened the whole population.
Every day we are seeing around 400 people in our mobile clinics. The problems basically are malaria, malnutrition. We are seeing a lot of severe acute malnutrition.
Hundreds of soldiers and civilians died in the recent fighting. Their bodies are still being collected, wrapped in bags and taken away for burial. There was a lot of heavy fighting in this neighbourhood between the government forces and the opposition who were based further behind here. This was a bakery which was hit by a tank shell because an opposition fighter was seen here. A lot of people now coming back are complaining their shops and homes have been looted. Many, like 15-year-old Stephen Saba, have lost everything. His mother, father and 3 sisters were all killed when their home was destroyed in the fighting. The future of this little boy, of everyone here, is in the hands of leaders seemingly unable to keep the world's youngest country together. Alistair Leithhead, BBC News, Juba.
In Turkey, President Erdogan has tonight declared a 3-month state of emergency and has warned that there will be more arrests in the coming days. He said the authorities would hunt down what he called elements of the terrorist organisation involved in the failed coup attempt at the weekend. So far, tens of thousands of people have been arrested, dismissed or suspended. From Turkey, our special correspondent Fergal Keane has just sent us this report.
They'd been told to expect a big announcement. Thousands crowded into squares across the country. As midnight approached, the president came on television and declared a state of emergency. It could mean sweeping powers of arrest and detention, press censorship, curfews, all under an existing article of the Constitution.
The purpose of the declaration of the state of emergency is, in fact, to be able to take the most efficient steps in order to remove this threat as soon as possible, which is a threat to democracy, to the rule of law, and to the rights and freedoms of our citizens in our country.
On the Bosphorus, the small boats conveyed the president's message of victory. On Taksim Square, an Ottoman band played military marches. Celebration to a warning rhythm. We met Jonsan Uyemaz, a widow who sells flags on the square. She's among many who want to see the coup leaders hanged.
We want a beautiful Turkey. We don't want it to be like Syria or Gaza. We want peace in Turkey. They will never be able to split us up. We will never allow it.
It is being framed as a defining national moment, a people's victory. Epitomised by this extraordinary imagery. A man confronting a tank on the night of the coup attempt. He is run over once, then gets up and is hit again. And yet he survives. I had 3 stones in my hand in case I ran across any of those dogs, says Sabri Unal. All I could do was respond to the tanks with the 3 stones I had. The arrests and sacking of public servants continued today, but there's no significant public outcry.
Nobody that I've spoken with across the political spectrum or in civil society wanted this coup to succeed. In Turkey, military coups have always meant disappearances, torture and executions. But the question now, as President Erdogan continues what he calls his cleansing of the state, is how far he will go and what kind of society he wants to create.
The struggle now is not the old battle of secular versus Islamist, but between those who wanted military dictatorship and a democratically elected president who has steadily monopolised power. This academic was in the past accused of insulting the president.
He will either change the course of this country to full authoritarianism like Russia, or begin to share power with civil society and political establishment more.
What do you think is the more likely option?
The second one.
Is that blind optimism?
It's optimism, but not blind.
In the afternoon, they came from across communities to mourn the dead of the failed coup attempt. And tonight, the crowds were back, cheering the president and knowing their country faces the most deep-rooted change in its recent history. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Istanbul.
Let's have a brief look at some of the day's other news stories. And the Labour Party says it's received more than 180,000 applications to vote in the party's upcoming leadership election and received those in the past 48 hours. The leader, Jeremy Corbyn, will face Pontypridd MP Owen Smith, with the result announced on the 24th of September. Mr Corbyn has been attending a rally of supporters in London tonight. A security alert in Brussels has been described by police as a false alarm. Officers were called following reports of a man acting suspiciously. The authorities say that he was, in fact, a student researching radiation levels in the Belgian capital. A senior British executive at HSBC has been arrested in New York and charged with alleged fraud. Mark Johnson was detained at JFK International Airport yesterday and has been accused of involvement in a scheme designed to generate profits at the expense of a major client. HSBC has so far declined to comment. Well, Donald Trump has arrived this evening at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio, where he'll formally accept the party's nomination as its presidential candidate. Mr. Trump is due to address the delegates tomorrow, but much of the business is still overshadowed by his wife's speech yesterday and the admission by a Trump worker that chunks of it were taken from a speech by Michelle Obama. Our North America editor, John Sopel, has the story.
The last 2 days may have been turbulent politically, but boy, does this quintessential showman know how to make an entrance. The music from the film Air Force One blaring as he touches down in Cleveland.
We're going to win Ohio, we're going to win it all. We're going to make America great again.
Last night, his hostile takeover of the Republican Party was complete, as state after state declared their support for him.
New York.
And in some neat stage management, it was the delegate votes from New York that meant he'd now won. The declaration coming from his son, Donald Trump Jr.
Congratulations, Dad, we love you!
Trump Sr. was in New York last night and expressed his thanks to the party via a video link.
I'm so proud to be your nominee for President of the United States. I look forward to sharing my thoughts with you on Thursday night on how we build a brighter and more hopeful future for all Americans.
There's still deep unease among many Republicans about Donald Trump, so they focused on the bit they can unite on, attacking Hillary Clinton, with Chris Christie almost literally leading the prosecution case against her.
As to Hillary Clinton lying to the American people about her selfish, awful judgment in making our secrets vulnerable. What's your verdict? Guilty or not guilty?
But that rarest thing from the Trump campaign to date, another guilty plea, as the speechwriter responsible for Melania Trump's address, you know, the one with key passages borrowed from Michelle Obama, fell upon her sword.
That you work hard for what you want in life. That your word is your bond, that you do what you say you're going to do.
The person responsible said she felt terrible for the chaos she'd caused and apologised to Mrs. Trump and Mrs. Obama. For 36 hours, the campaign tried to tough it out, insisting there'd been no plagiarism and there was nothing to say sorry for. Today, finally, they blinked. Well, tonight the Republican leadership is hoping that the focus will switch to Donald Trump's running mate, the Indiana governor, Mike Pence. He's a Christian conservative with a long track record as a political insider. And that's important because he's on the ticket to reassure traditional Republicans. The one thing he can be trusted to do is not upstage Mr. Trump himself. Hugh.
John, again, thanks very much. John Sopel there for us, our North America editor in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, the government here is being urged to divert billions of pounds intended for home ownership schemes into affordable rented housing. Property experts are saying that there are signs that private house building might be slowing down following the Brexit vote, and local authorities and housing associations in England are calling on ministers to change tack. Our home editor, Mark Easton, has the story.
At the brickworks near Accrington in Lancashire, they're preparing to switch off the kiln. These bricks are known for their strength. They hold up the Empire State Building. But when the chimney stops smoking, it's usually the first sign of a slowdown in house building, an industry that acts as an early warning system for the wider economy.
The construction industry is built on confidence, and private house building was already falling even before the Brexit vote, and analysts say the situation is only going to get much worse.
There are different views, but one respected consultancy is warning that a slowdown like 2008 would wipe out a third of GDP growth and cost 120,000 jobs in 10 years.
1 and 3, 13.
So the question is, in uncertain times, who's going to call house?
4 and 1.
At a bingo session at Sutton in Craven, just across the Pennines in North Yorkshire, they think they may have the answer to keeping Britain building during post-Brexit anxiety. The bingo is held in an old mill that had been due to become luxury private flats before the last recession. But the original developer went bust after the crash, and instead local housing associations stepped in and rejigged the plans in favour of social and supported housing. Anne was one of the first through the door.
Oh, it was like I died and gone to heaven, because at that moment I was panicking. I mean, my husband was in hospital and they wanted him to go into a nursing home, and I didn't want him to go into a nursing home.
And if this hadn't existed,
I wouldn't have been able to have my husband.
With private builders likely to retrench post-Brexit, housing associations are saying they're ready to step in again. But for that to happen this time, they say government should divert some of the £7 billion earmarked for home ownership schemes such as starter homes into affordable rented housing.
can you really make the difference, do you think?
Absolutely. Housing associations are ready and willing to build as many homes as the country needs. We can really step in when house builders have to turn their plans down. We actually build with less public funding than we've ever had. Every pound the government puts in, we can add £6 of our own money to build the homes that these communities around us need.
Decisions on affordable housing will be taken by the Chancellor in his next budget, the new Housing Minister Gavin Barwell has said, conceding that a powerful case has been made for investment in homes for rent as well as for sale. Mark Easton, BBC News.
The new England football manager will be the Sunderland boss, Sam Allardyce. The BBC understands that he will be appointed sometime tomorrow, replacing Roy Hodgson, who resigned last month after the team was knocked out of Euro 2016 by Iceland. Our sports editor, Dan Rowan, has more details.
With England in big trouble, the FA have called for Big Sam. He may not be everyone's choice, but Sam Allardyce is now set for the job he's always coveted. Tonight, the 61-year-old arrived for his final game in charge of Sunderland, a pre-season friendly at lowly Hartlepool United. But his appointment as the next England manager is expected to be confirmed in the next 24 hours.
Questions will be asked about his style of football, but ultimately he's never had money to go and buy great players. Yes, at times he's played direct, but he's played with what he's got, and he's got the best out of the players that he's had. The players like him, and I think that's a huge bonus for England.
A tough tackling central defender, but who could also score goals, Allardyce enjoyed a 21-year-long career as a player, starring for Bolton Wanderers in the 1970s. And it was at the same club that he went on to make his name as a manager. Known as a wheeler dealer in the transfer market, he led Bolton first to the Premier League and then to Europe. Achievements that saw him interviewed for the England job back in 2006.
I just hope that when the phone call comes, it's in my favour and nobody else's, and then if it doesn't, then I'll accept it.
Having masterminded Sunderland's miraculous escape from relegation last season, the FA came calling. Tonight, the club's fans reacted to the news.
I think he'll do well. I think he's the right man for the job, but obviously disappointing that he's leaving Sunderland. But best of luck to him.
Sad, but it's been his ambition, and you can't stop anybody from wanting to fulfil their ambition.
Tonight, in a statement, Sunderland said, at the present time, Sam Allardyce remains our manager. We share in the anger and frustration of our supporters and would like to assure them that we're working to conclude the matter in the best interests of Sunderland AFC. Allardyce must now confound those who see the role of England manager as sport's impossible job, breathing new life into the team after the humiliation of being knocked out of the Euros by minnows Iceland. The man he'll now replace, Roy Hodgson, resigning in the wake of that defeat. This morning, the governing body's chief executive told me what he wanted from the man tasked with giving the national team a new identity.
The new manager's got to be someone that can inspire people to get the best out of themselves that they can, build resilience, I think, and unashamedly adopt the kind of psychological techniques that other sports and frankly other football teams have done.
Allardyce may have never won a major trophy, he may be seen as old school, but his reputation as one of the country's leading coaches is based on the fact none of his teams have ever been relegated from the Premier League either. His challenge now to lift England off rock bottom. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
Right, Newsnight's on BBC Two. Here's Evan.
There's joy in the Conservative Party today, but is there also some division? Theresa May seems to have had a solid first week, far be it from us to spoil it, but challenges do lurk ahead. We'll be looking at some of those. Join me now on BBC Two.
That's Newsnight with Evan here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.